All right, well, I'm so happy to be here today with Justin Wells. I've been looking forward to a conversation with Justin for a while. He has been doing great work over on his channel, Justin's Morning Coffee. He's been looking at the 7 basic plot types and kind of mapping them onto the hero's journey, which has kind of opened up a whole new vista for me. Like you, Justin, I had struggled, right, to kind of make the hero's journey work as a tool, right, when I was writing. I would often write something and then find that, oh, it has certain elements of it. I can see elements of it, but I wasn't really setting out. I couldn't really set out, oh, I'm going to write the monomyth, right, or I'm going to write a version of the monomyth. So anyway, the reason I reached out to have a conversation is I was reading this famous essay by JRR Tolkien called On Faerie Stories, and I started to get very curious about how you would think. I know you've read the essay and how and you think highly of it. How you think that works in relationship to the 7 basic plots, right? Because he's really talking about kind of a realm, right? A world and certain rules. And one thing that occurred to me, I was just watching your awesome 2 videos on tragedy, and I started wondering, is this realm of fairy, right, where these fantasy stories take place, is it possible to think of that as the mirror image of the Oedipus Rex tragedy? And what made me think of that is you were talking about the Oedipus Rex tragedy, that pattern of story, Chinatown, Bonnie and Clyde. Is Bonnie and Clyde in, or no? Bonnie and Clyde's in the other type of tragedy, right? Yeah.
It's halfway in between.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot. There's some blurring of the lines there that we can get into. But you started talking about this Oedipus Rex tragedy. I guess the other one was No Country for Old Men, right? Where there's this overwhelming. There's someone who's in control, right? Some evil force in control. It's either fate or it's embodied in a person in Chinatown, Noah Cross. And there's this sort of sense of I cannot escape. No matter how well things go in the short term, I am not going to be able to escape this oncoming train of fate or this great evil that's out there. And as I was reading Tolkien, he's talking about this realm of fairy as being about the desirable, right? Like it's a projection of what we desire. And there's all sorts of things that can go wrong in one of these stories, in a fantasy story. Obviously, there's moments of great darkness in The Lord of the Rings, for example. But Tolkien also talks about this Eucatastrophe, right? This kind of the opposite of a catastrophe, the opposite of the ending of Chinatown, right? Where everything kind of turns out okay. And I think there's also this sense, I get this sense when I haven't read The Lord of the Rings in quite a long time, but I get this sense that it's kind of infused with hope, right? And that there's this sense that almost no matter how bad things get, good is going to carry through. So anyway, I'm curious, what do you make of that? Is that would you agree with that, or how do you where does that how do you think about Tolkien's thoughts as it relates to the 7 plots?
Yeah, well, so I just listened to it on tape yesterday, just to
cool. Yeah,
brush up on it, and I hadn't thought about it in terms of maybe I should just say what the 7 basic plots are.
You should. Yep.
So basically, there's this big fat book by Christopher Booker, a British journalist, who wrote it. It's called The 7 Basic Plots, and he basically argues that there's 7 archetypal plots. Not that all stories fit into these 7, but these are 7 clear ones. Yep. And they are Rags to Riches, Overcoming the Monster, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, Quest, and Rebirth. And so what I've been doing is I've been like just slowly working my way through each of the 7 to really try to figure out what their essence is, using a little bit of Christopher Booker and then going off on my own, using a little bit more movie examples than literary examples, just because that's what I'm more familiar with. And I think probably most people that want today would be more familiar with the movies.
Yeah, and I think your and the huge innovation in what you're doing, I think, is mapping like let's just say lots of people have talked about, well, there's 3 types of stories or there's 4 types of stories, and I've actually never read the Booker, but your work is kind of making me very curious. But I think your great innovation is then mapping those onto the hero's journey and saying that each of these has a place. Because Booker doesn't really say that, does he? Right? That's your sort. You're bringing that to the table and sort of saying these go in. They kind of fit in an order. If you think about the hero's journey as this 2-mountain system, the Jungian 2-mountain system, is that right?
Yeah, he kind of hints at it.
Okay.
He doesn't really. He goes, yeah, maybe these could all fit on a life cycle.
Yep.
But he doesn't really. And I present them in a slightly different order than he does. But basically, yeah, I started to really take that idea seriously, and I thought, well, okay, so let me see. As I familiarize myself with each of these 7,
Yep.
would they fit kind of on a life cycle? And so you kind of start with rags to riches. That's usually a children's story like Aladdin or Cinderella, and it's starting with somebody that has pure potential, hasn't done anything, and then how to get from pure potential to actually accomplish something. You might say proper rulership. They usually wind up king or queen of their own little kingdom by the end of the story.
Exactly.
But then, what happens next in your life is that once you start to accomplish things, you get obstacles, you get bullies, so you get pushback. So then the overcoming the monster story I put next. Booker doesn't put that in that quite order. So that's, I guess, my thing. But it makes sense to me. Like, you would then encounter some bullies, some pushback. If you start winning at baseball, they're going to start hitting you.
Yep.
If you're the best hitter on the team, they're going to start throwing at you.
Well, and your journey doesn't end, but once you achieve success, right? There are people who are going to come. Right. There are people who are going to come after you. But I think an important thing though is the way it's sort of like each one can have elements, right? So in other words, the rags to riches story, you might encounter monsters along the way, right? You might encounter the ugly stepsisters, for example, right? Who are trying to, right? But it's sort of a mini monster, right? It's not. It's anyway. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so exactly. So these are all little complete stories, but if you look at it kind of fractally, it's kind of like that belongs kind of. It's a little mini version over here, and you're going to encounter maybe a bigger monster later. That's actually what happens in the hero's journey.
Yep.
Is you cross the threshold and then you find a monster, and so you could say there's a little mini overcoming the monster story embedded within that other story, and then basically so the first half of life you might think of primarily as success, and then the second half of life as legacy. So you think of it kind of like accomplishing things and learning things and forming your own identity the first half of life, and then the second half of life you're figuring out how to give it back, everything that you accomplished, and how to pass it on to the next generation. So it's kind of, I see that there's just these certain plots kind of are going up the mountain of success.
Yep.
Which is rags to riches, overcoming the monster, and voyage and return, which is the Robinson Crusoe story, the journey and back again story, and then comedy. And then that's kind of the pinnacle of that first mountain.
It's kind of,
and then
comedy, as you've described, is kind of finding your place, right? You're already starting from a place of relative strength, but you're not quite matched to your environment, or you don't know quite where you fit in. And then comedy is sort of the I'm really looking forward to your videos on comedy. You've hinted that it's a complex one to take on, and I think you're probably right. But yeah, finding your place, right? So it's
like Bridget Jones. Bridget Jones is lost in this world, and she's looking for her other half.
Exactly.
So she's confused about who she is and what her place is at the beginning, and then she finds herself by the end.
Exactly.
And that's why people are always in disguises and things, like in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Shakespeare. It's like everybody's got multiple identities and disguises and fake names and stuff, and then everything's confused, and then they're kind of find their rightful place by the end of it.
Exactly. Or comedies of remarriage, right? Where you used to be in the right place, now you're not in the right place, right? And then kind of getting back to the right place. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's maybe just a little sketch of so I can answer your question now.
Yep. Getting to the top of the first mountain, right? And then,
yeah. And then the quest and rebirth stories are really about getting to that second mountain. And the tragedy, in my view, is if you never make it to the second mountain.
Yeah.
If you die on the first mountain of success, like Ebenezer Scrooge, you just hoard everything and then you never learn how to give it back.
Yep.
You know, that would be a tragic story. But that's, again, that's just a way of kind of like framing it and thinking of it. It's not saying that they all fit. Every single story fits in this way, but that if I squint and look back at everything, I kind of see this pattern, you know, this kind of general pattern.
No, I think it's really insightful. I think it's very, very helpful. Yep, yep. And I think the other thing, there's the Scrooge version of the tragedy, right, where you get stuck on the mountain with hoarding your gold. But then there's kind of the Walter White version, right, where you always, there's a certain eagerness and ambition and an eagerness for adventure that serves a person well, right? And if you get to the top of the mountain and you're not capable, you kind of keep looking for the next mountain, right? That I think is a danger, right? Like I need to build my empire, as you said, right? He's built, or as Walter White said, I guess, right? I'm going to keep building my empire. Like you keep looking to ascend, right? Almost like Icarus, you're getting too, you know, your mountain's getting too close to the sun in a sense. Yeah. So go ahead. Yeah. So let's talk about this tragedy versus Tolkien's. Yeah.
All right. So this is what struck me reading the essay again.
Yeah.
Is that so? Tolkien says, all right, you know, there's a certain kind of story called a fairy story. It's not a story that has fairies in it. It's a story about a certain realm or land that is the land of fairy, you know. And he distinguished it, interestingly enough, from like Alice in Wonderland. It's not a dream that you wake up from. And that's sort of actually where I was putting the Voyage and Return plot, which is the Alice in Wonderland, Back to the Future plot, which is sort of like you go to another world. And it's even in Back to the Future, he falls asleep, goes back in time, and then wakes up. There's a match shot of him going to sleep on his bed and then waking up on his bed. So there's this kind of like motif in those kinds of stories of you need to be renewed somehow, and so you need to fall asleep and you go into this other world and you get you learn you mature in that other fantasy world, and then when you come back to this world, you're better suited for accomplishing what you need to accomplish in this world. But I think Tolkien might be distinguishing it a little bit from that and saying that the land of fairy is a certain reality that is like what you said, the desire, you know, that it's a realm that maybe is real, that we're sort of reaching for.
We're striving for. Yeah. We want to get back to, or we want to, we want to participate in. Yeah, there's something about Wonderland. Wonderland is a very different place than Middle Earth, right? It is not. Middle Earth has this. Wonderland just feels kind of mixed up, right? Whereas Middle Earth kind of has this grand moral, right? It just stretches out. I don't know. There's something about Middle Earth that has, and it stretches out both in terms of desirability. It just seems it's so. Right, there's something very desirable about it in a way that I don't think Wonderland has, you know?
Yeah, Wonderland is a bunch of, it seems like to me, it's a bunch of distortions.
Yes.
You know, so it makes sense that it's like a dream / nightmare, you know, sort of, it's a world where things are inverted, you know, so like she gets super big and she gets super small.
Yep.
You know, the Mad Hatter, it's like, there's madness, there's inversions, there's upside down, you know, so that's characteristic of that story.
Yep.
Is that you go into an underworld, an inverted world. I think maybe that's what it is. It's more like the journey to Hades and back than it is like what Tolkien is talking about with these fairy stories.
Yep, I like that.
So I don't think so. I couldn't actually put one of the fairy stories into one of my 7 basic plots.
Well, in a sense, it's orthogonal to the plots, right? Because it's a realm, it's not a plot, right? It's a realm, it's not a plot. But do you think the Eucatastrophe, right? He talks about the Eucatastrophe. Do you think that is that the opposite of a tragic ending?
Well, yeah. So when I was studying the tragedy, I noticed that there seemed to be two types of tragic plots. One is based on Oedipus Rex, or a good example is the movie Seven.
Yep.
So these two cops, Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, are chasing John Doe, the serial killer, but they don't know that John Doe is 3 steps ahead of them, and he's basically making them do whatever he wants because he's way smarter than they are.
Yep.
So that's the same as kind of the world of the Greek gods that are toying with you, like in the world of Oedipus Rex, where there's this prophecy that you can't get away from. And there's a sense that, like in the beginning of Seven, the implied prophecy is that John Doe is going to get Brad Pitt to do what he does at the end of the movie. I don't necessarily spoil it, but
Sort
it's
of
a
an
famous
evil puppet master, right? Like
Yes.
like Noah Cross in Chinatown. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's the catastrophe is this awareness or realization that all along you have been just with a puppet. You're a puppet with strings attached to you, and someone's got their fingers on those strings and they're controlling what you do.
And human will, right, like free will and choice, right, is kind of downplayed in the Oedipus Rex, right, in the classic tragedy, right? It's almost like you're being told, don't. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what choices you make. This is coming for you, right?
Yes, exactly.
Whereas human will, in the other type of tragedy, human will is emphasized, right? Like they make a deal with the devil, right? Like, I want X. If I make this deal with the devil, then I can get X, and I'll be okay, right?
Yes, the Faustian. I call that one the Faustian.
Exactly. Yep. That's good.
So if you take the Greek, let's just call it the Greek style of tragedy, and at the catastrophe being not just the fact that all those events were set up, but when you, the character, become aware of it. That's because in Oedipus, he gouges out his eyes at the end. Why? Because he realizes that all along he had already murdered his father and married his mother. This terrible thing.
Yep. And he hasn't been able to see clearly, right, until that point, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And now he gouges out his eyes, so he can't see physically, but now his other eye is open in a sense that he can now see that he's in this place. So that's the catastrophe. So it seems like that the Greek worldview was such that was the only way you could think of fate.
Yep.
In terms of this catastrophe, because life is you don't have control of life. Bad things and everybody dies at the end of life. So when Tolkien is saying the Eucatastrophe, he's just saying it's like that, where all of these things were working unbeknownst to you behind the scenes, but not for your downfall, not to put you in your place, but for your good or for your salvation. So I think actually the end of the Lord of the Rings is the perfect example of the Eucatastrophe, because Gollum is chasing them, and so it's a weird thing that you think of Gollum as evil, which, he's selfish. He wants the ring for himself, but he's being used by some sort of sense of providence, and it's actually providence that's chasing him, because providence will eventually cause him to fall into the Mount Doom with that ring. And so now the awareness is, oh my gosh, something has been working behind the scenes, unbeknownst to me,
exactly,
to get rid of this evil from the world.
Exactly.
And that's the Eucatastrophe.
Yep. Did you study on Faerie Stories? So did you study in film school, or where were you first exposed to that essay? I'm curious.
Oh, well, I didn't really read it that closely until you mentioned.
Seriously? Okay. Oh, good.
I mean, I've heard of it. Of course, I've heard of the Eucatastrophe, and and Leaf by Niggle is another Tolkien thing that kind of has similar themes.
Oh, what's it called?
So, Leaf by Niggle.
I don't know.
Oh, you haven't?
I don't know Leaf by Niggle. No, I don't know that at all. Is it?
Well, it's a great little story about just a guy that lives out in the country, and he has this vision of a tree.
Okay.
He has a vision of a tree, and he wants to paint it,
but
he can't get it right, and he keeps trying and trying, and the only thing that he can get right is one leaf, but the rest of the painting remains unfinished, and it's underneath a tarp in his shed.
Okay.
And so then he sort of dies and goes to purgatory, and then kind of gets out of purgatory and winds up in essentially paradise. And he sees this tree and he goes, "Oh my gosh, that's exactly the tree that I was been trying to paint this whole time." You know, but unfortunately I never finished it. You know, I never. But then you go back. The end of the story is you go back to Earth, and they've uncovered his thing, and they found that leaf, and they thought, "Wow, this is the perfect leaf," and they cut it out of his painting and put it on display, and they put "Leaf by Niggle" on it. So, so
Awesome.
I think it has similar themes in the sense of like there's this other world.
Yep.
In the form of this vision of a tree that he has of the perfect tree, and that's what he's trying to capture with his art, you know, and but he only can do part of it. Like that's another theme in Tolkien is that you can only do your part. You can't do everything, you know.
Yeah, as you were describing that plot, I kind of thought, I wonder if the ending of this story is they're going to go back and they're going to find that other people were painting the other parts of the tree, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
go there. Yeah, I need to explore more Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien is so knowledgeable, right? So I'm reading on Faerie Stories, and it's dripping with references. It's just dripping with references to
Yeah.
mythology, to languages, and it's really amazing. I mean, his depth of, I don't know, it makes it hard to read in some sense, right? Because I feel like I'm picking up on a lot of the meaning, and then certain of the meanings are just going over my head. Yeah. Yeah, the other thing I really liked about that essay was just this idea that myth and history are made of the same stuff, right? And so he talks about how certain mythological elements from like fairy tales got attached. Like I guess there's this story about a goose girl, and there are elements of that story that later got quote unquote attached to the mother of Charlemagne, right? And he argues, right, that what's really going on, where it's actually saying it backward, right? To say that the myth got attached to the person is actually saying it backward, because in a sense, there's this soup, right? This cauldron of history, right, and of story, and that it's got all these mythological elements to it, and then certain people arise in history, right, who become well known for one thing or the other, and then they get cooked into the pot, right? And there's all this stuff mushing around in the pot, and so the story gets attached to them. It's not that we took this mythological thing and attached it to some person from history. It's that the person from history got sucked in to this cauldron of story, whereby we kind of understand who we are and where we come from, right? Really kind of interesting.
So would you say that it's a sense that they lived into a certain archetype, maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think what he was arguing is that, these we're sort of destined to repeat these like in our lives, right? You point out Hitler, right, living out this tragic archetype, right? And I've been listening to a couple podcasts on history. Do you listen to The Rest Is History sometimes?
Hmm. Yeah.
And then there's
I love it.
yeah, it's wonderful. And then there's a more dramatic one called The Real Dictators. Have you ever listened to that
Oh,
one?
I haven't seen that. No,
So
no, no.
it's a British podcast, and they take one dictator at a time, and I think for Hitler they've done like 15 or 16, following the whole arc of his life. And you're right, it totally maps onto the tragic, right? The
Yeah.
tragedy, right? In fact, the Faustian tragedy, I would argue,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yes.
And I think what Tolkien is arguing that, right, like Hitler. I mean, in some ways we've taken what we know about Hitler and we've put the tragic arc upon his life, right? Like that's what Real Dictators is doing when they make the podcast. But in another
Yeah.
sense, that tragic archetype was there. That plot was already there, and
Yeah.
many people have lived that out through history, right? And Hitler was falling into a common trap, right? And he was right. He was living out the worst kind of tragedy, right?
Yeah.
Like he had the worst of the fatal flaws. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. It's hard. It's really hard, I think, to discard this modern frame, right? Like that we've grown up with, right? That history is what happened to real people, right? And it's why we spend so much time talking about you know, the truth of the resurrection, right? Because we're very obsessed. We moderns are very obsessed with what really is. You know, it's Paul's distinction between. Everybody says literally, what literally happened, right? But it's really what physically happened. We're very obsessed with what physically happened, and we don't like. There's no way to know what physically happened with Hitler, but you can very easily map what happened in his life onto the Faustian tragedy, right? It's very easy to see that, and it's not just us. I don't think it's just us putting that on him, right? He was living into that plot, wasn't he?
Yeah. Well, I would say, you could say it may be like the pattern of that tragic pattern is what happens when you make certain choices. You might say,
yeah,
you know, it's like how it will play out.
Yep.
And that's why I think it's more useful for us to have a catalog of historical figures that fit these archetypes, because it tells you how to act in the world.
It does. Yep.
As opposed to if you say, well, I just want to know just what happened, exactly what happened, but it might not mean anything in that, can't say, you know, like if you just say, okay, well, and you know, this person did this and this and this, and you're like, well, what significance does that have to me with me?
Well, and our brain couldn't even handle what really happened. What really happened, like, was like there's just too much data there. Like you can't absorb what really happened. What you can absorb is that this guy fell into this basic plot. But the way you describe it, Justin, is very Judeo-Christian, right? In a sense, because you're saying he made a bad choice. We use these stories to avoid making bad choices, right? And I agree with you, right? I think I share those assumptions, but it's very different, I think, than the Oedipus Rex story, right? Where we're really being controlled, you know, where human will doesn't matter, right? We live, I think, for better and for worse, probably mostly for better, in a world in which we believe human choices matter, right? Yeah. Although I wonder if you could argue, did you read the repaganization of the West? It was an article by Louise Perry. Do you know Louise Perry?
Okay. Yes.
So she wrote an article for First Things, right? Louise Perry is not a practicing Christian, but she wrote for First Things, this kind of conservative Catholic journal. She wrote a very compelling essay called The Repaganization of the West. And what's fascinating to think about that is, if we are repaganizing, are we then going to be more interested in these stories in which human will is downplayed, right? In which fate is a bigger, is a kind of a something we can't avoid. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's exactly, if you want to understand the Coen brothers,
right.
That's exactly what I think you need to understand.
Right.
Is because they've moved farther and farther, or I should say closer and closer to that Oedipus style over the years, you know? It's just this, it's a weird thing. It's just this like sort of downplaying of choice, and more and more and more a sense of being caught in a web, you know? And it's just more and more fatalistic in a way. Yeah. You know. Well, it's like the end of No Country for Old Men. You know, right. That's a perfect example of it, I think.
Well, and contrast that with Raising Arizona, and this is why I don't like these. I don't like a lot of these Oedipus Rex style tragedies. Like, my personal tastes run against them. My favorite Coen Brothers movie, by far, is Raising Arizona, right? Because there's a Eucatastrophe. Right? There's a Eucatastrophe at the end, and all these choices that are being made, they make horrible choices, right? They make the Faustian bargain, right? Right? Ed and High and Ed, right? They make the Faustian bargain. They go and steal someone else's baby because they think that's their way to get a family. And they pay a price for it. But in the end, we see this vision of the Eucatastrophe where they're together and they have grandkids and there's happy music. You know, it's like, it's a...
Remind me how that one ends. It's been a long time since
Yeah,
I've seen
so it ends, I can't remember exactly what happens to them, but they get caught, right? They turn the baby back over. Oh, right, they go back. Oh, that's right, okay. So they return to the furniture guy's house, and it's kind of a return to the beginning of the movie, right? And they put the ladder up, and they climb up, and they return this Nathan Jr. to the crib, and then Nathan Sr. comes in, and they have I get a little emotional even think about it because I love that movie so much. It's because it's the Eucatastrophe, right? They have a moment with this guy from whom they stole the kid, right? And he shows them grace. He lets them go, and then High starts imagining, like it goes into this kind of dreamy voiceover where he's imagining what the future might hold, and he envisions, and it's very fuzzy and glowy, and he envisions two elderly people surrounded by kids and grandkids, right? So it's a classic Eucatastrophe, even though they made that Faustian bargain, right? It's yeah, and it's always been my favorite movie, and I've often wondered why I have not, despite their great skill, right? I don't respond. Like when I watch No Country for Old Men, I don't respond to that movie. And I think I have a very strong predilection for the Eucatastrophe, right? For the not. I think especially. I actually don't mind the Faustian bargain so much. I don't know. It's hard to process. But I've sensed that they have been moving in a direction that I wasn't as comfortable with, and I think you've articulated it, right. They're going more towards this fatalistic type of movie making. Yeah, I had taken a class at UCLA back when I was writing screenplays. I had taken a class on writing the 1-hour drama, a TV drama, and the teacher, very good teacher, but I was quite frustrated because he wanted us to write tragedies. Right? Like the way he taught the class was, look at The Sopranos, look at Breaking Bad. Like this is how you craft a 1-hour drama, right? You create a character, perhaps they have a fatal flaw, perhaps not, right? But fate is coming for them, and they're going to get run over by fate. And he was almost adamant that was the only type of story. And I was trying to write something more like some big thing like Lost, right? Like some big mystery that was more conventional by modern standards. And he wanted things to be more fatalistic. And I've wondered if it does seem like we have a glut of those kinds of stories right now.
Yeah. Well, I was pretty soon here when I get to the rebirth plot, when I go over that. Talk a little bit about Woody Allen's journey in that same direction, I think.
Yep.
He has been remaking Crime and Punishment for years.
Yep.
And each successive remake, because Crime and Punishment is a rebirth story.
Yep.
He makes a bargain with the devil. I don't know if you're familiar with.
I've never read Crime and Punishment. Yeah, I just read The Brothers Karamazov for the first time, so I need to get a Crime and Punishment. Yeah.
Real quick, in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov says, if you want to be a true hero, you have to transcend morality. And so he goes, if I could find a murderous act to do that everybody would be grateful that I killed this old lady because she's annoying to everybody, I would be a higher form of man or something like that. It's kind of a neat.
Yeah, it's a Nietzschean thing. Yep.
So he does it. But then his conscience starts eating away at him, and he winds up, his conscience bothers him so much that he turns himself in, basically.
Yep.
So the idea is that even though he tried to transcend the rules of morality, let's say, create his own reality, he couldn't do it. His conscience wouldn't let him.
Well, in a sense, he tried to be a god, right? He tried to.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So Woody Allen then had made Crimes and Misdemeanors.
Yep.
And Crimes and Misdemeanors was a remake of that same plot, except for he really wrestled with the idea that maybe you could turn off your conscience. Maybe you could just walk away. So in his character finally wrestles and wrestles and wrestles, almost turns himself in, but at the very last second doesn't do it.
Yep.
You see him happy in the end.
Yeah, I haven't seen
So
that.
the
Oh, you see
idea
him
is,
happy, right?
yeah. And so that Woody Allen's point was, well, there is no higher morality, so you could, in theory, turn off your conscience if you don't get caught. Like the only place you could get caught is in this world.
Yeah, there's
And then
an.
he finally,
Go ahead.
what's that?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, and then he finally does it a third time. He remakes it a third time with a movie called Match Point.
That's the one I remember. The
Yes.
tennis movie with Scarlett Johansson. Yeah.
Yes. And in that case, he commits the murder, but it's not because he wants to be a higher man. It's just because he doesn't want his life to be ruined by the affair being with Scarlett Johansson being exposed.
Yep.
But the whole point, the whole motif in running through it is luck.
Yep.
And so he's just lucky that he didn't get caught.
Yeah, isn't there's some crucial piece of evidence that bounces on a bridge and falls into the water, right? And they
he's trying to throw it in the water, but it bounces back, and so then a bum picks it up, and then the police find it and say, oh, well, that must have been the killer because he's got her ring.
Oh, I forgot. Yep.
So it gets pinned on another guy, and so he gets away with just luck, and then the last line of the movie is, they're going to have a baby, and let's hope that he has a prosperous life. And he goes, well, forget that. I just hope he's lucky.
Well, don't they intercut that with, because he's a tennis pro, right? And don't they intercut that with a tennis ball, right? Like hitting the net and bouncing up, and you don't know whether it's going to fall on one side or the other. It's interesting because that plays right into the No Country for Old Men, right? The flipping of the coin.
Yeah.
I really wonder Louise Perry's the one who said we're repaganizing. I always thought, well, we're kind of moving toward a Gnostic age, right? In certain ways. But she persuasively argued that, not persuasively, she persuasively made me wonder whether we're repaganizing and whether maybe we're being drawn to more of those types of stories. It might explain some of my frustration with modern movie making. I just don't love a lot of modern movie making. And it's hard for me to always articulate why am I so dissatisfied with these stories. And if they're moving more fatalistic, the way I was taught is in screenwriting, and the way I think because I have that Judeo-Christian worldview imprinted on me, right, is that choice, right, and that stories about, like you said, stories about are about helping us process how we make choices, right, and so you're always trying to put your protagonist in a position of making difficult choices, and you're trying to do that in a way that helps the audience kind of see certain patterns. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm thinking about that directly when I'm writing, but it seems like something that's kind of percolating under the surface.
Yeah, I mean, if the only thing that is determining whether or not your life turns out good or not is just chance, just luck, just the coin flip or the tennis ball hitting the net and bouncing on one side or the other.
Yep.
Then in one sense, it might be related to Aristotle's notion of catharsis, in the sense of you don't feel so bad that your life didn't turn out well because you're not really in control,
Yep.
And so I've been really rethinking, because in film school and everything, the notion of catharsis was always, that's what a story is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you catharsis.
Yeah.
But now I'm realizing that Tolkien's notion of eucatastrophe is not catharsis. Because it might be, and I'm not sure about this because I'm not an expert on Aristotle, but it might be the opposite of catharsis, in the same way that the eucatastrophe is the opposite of the catastrophe. Mm-hmm. In the sense that
You are the recipient of undeserved grace in some sense.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. And so rather than thinking, well, the reason why my life is, all of our lives are so bad, you think of an ancient Greek person, what their life was, with going to this theater, and the gods are in control. There's thunder and lightning up on Mount Olympus and everything. And then you get this glimpse of, it's even bad for the king. Even he is controlled by this. as opposed to, and this is what makes everybody upset post World War II about the Christian worldview, is it puts so much hope. You know, it's always looking towards the future in the sense of this providential thing working out for your good. And then you have to square that with the fact that maybe your life isn't what you would want it to be.
Well, and you have to square that with the fact that the Holocaust happened, right? Like if there's if there's an underlying good, right, that's kind of carrying everything through, then why does the Holocaust happen? So have you read the Poetics? I've never read the Poetics.
Way back in college I did.
Yeah.
I've tried to understand it. See, the thing is, I don't think I knew enough context about the Greek worldview back then to really. I would have to really look at it again, I think.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to look at it. So, do you remember what the concept of catharsis is? Like, I have a conventional, like, modern definition of that word in my head. Do you remember what Aristotle meant? Like, how did he define catharsis?
Well,
I'm putting
as
you
far
on the
as
spot.
I remember, it was like an emotional release.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which comes from. Now, I don't know where Aristotle starts and my old screenwriting professors end, but basically, I've always thought of it as the notion of a rushback when, you realize something is revealed in the story, which causes you to rush back and rethink everything that you saw before.
All right.
Because new information.
Yeah. Which is a delightful thing when that happens. When that happens effectively, it's a delightful thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
exactly.
And often there actually is a rushback where the protagonist, like Harry Met Sally. When you said rushback, I just thought of when Harry Met Sally, of Harry rushing back to find Sally, right?
Yeah. So, or like the twist, like a twist ending, that little new piece of information causes you. So I always associated it with like a emotional release that you get by seeing how all these pieces fit together in the story. And that emotional release then allows you to go back to ordinary mundane life with a measure of,
bringing back the token from the underworld in a sense. What I was always taught, I took a lot of screenwriting classes and read a lot of books, but I never went to film school, and so never read some of these classics. But the way I was always taught by my teacher, Steve Mazer, he was the most influential teacher I had. He wrote Liar, Liar. He wrote one of the Little Rascals movies. He had a background in improv. Great. He's just a great teacher. But he wasn't focusing on like Joseph Campbell type stuff. He wasn't focusing on like, all of this big picture stuff. He was focusing on the micro mechanics of conventional movies. Conventional Hollywood movies, and he was writing mostly comedies. And the way he articulated is that your character wants something, right? And their act two, the frustration, right? Like when I think of the 3-act structure in your five stage structure, the frustration is mostly act 2, right? Where they want something, they're working towards it. And at least in a small sense, it was a Faustian bargain, right? They were looking for the wrong thing, and so they end up not getting what they want, right? And then there's the dark night of the soul, right? In kind of the beginning of Act 3, where they're very, very unhappy and alone, right? And they didn't get what they want. And then they get some sort of new information, right? Which makes them look back. I think this is rushback concept that you're talking about. And they, instead of getting what they wanted and what they were working so hard to get, they get what they needed, right?
Yes.
And then usually at the very ending in the comedy, right, is because they get what they needed, then something opens up for them, and then they end up getting what they wanted after all, right? And so they get both in the end. But they were chasing it through they were, in a sense, they had created an idol, right? They had some positive vision of the future and ambition that you admired, and they decided to go after X. But X wasn't quite the right thing, right? It looked about right, but it wasn't quite right. And so then they needed to then they get what they need, and then they're able to get what they want. Anyway.
Like Phil Connors in Groundhog Day.
Yes, exactly. Oh, it's classic, yes, exactly.
He wants Rita.
Yep.
but he goes about it the wrong way. He wants her for the wrong reasons.
Yep.
But he winds up with Rita in the end, once he goes through the dark night of the soul and readjusts all of his
And
priorities.
once he accepts who he is and sort of, yep,
Yeah.
yep. Well, it's the same thing. I mean, we studied like Big was always a movie that we studied a lot. You've seen Big, the Tom Hanks movie? Yeah. You know, he wants to be big, right? He pursues that. There's all sorts of positive that flows from that, right? In a sense, it's a Faustian bargain, right? You could argue it's like a mini Faustian bargain without sort of the darker undertones. And then what he needs is to accept that he's still a child and let the growing up happen slowly, right? And then, you know, eventually that's, you know, it's sort of implied at the end of the movie, but he's going to see all of that down the road, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I never thought of it, but that's kind of akin to the eating of the fruit in the garden, because you want it right now.
Oh, right.
Knowledge of good and evil or maturity, you know, you want, and so you eat it because you want it now, when really you're supposed to wait until you're ready to be able to digest that.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Yeah, it's the temptation of the now, right? And well, Peterson talks about this so much, right? So much of what these stories are doing is telling us to like postpone gratification, just in the simplest way, right? Like sacrifice in the near term, not just for yourself, right? But in the greatest sense, sacrifice for your family, for your, you know, for society as a whole, for, you know, even more. What do you think? So Peterson talks a lot, when I hear him talk about Christ and the crucifixion and the resurrection, I sometimes hear him, he almost acts like it's the purest expression of the monomyth, right? Like Christ is the greatest hero, like he's the greatest man that we need to emulate. And obviously there are elements of that, but to me, there's something, you know Girard, right? You know Rene Girard, right? Like Girard seems to think the exact opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
Girard is almost arguing like this is an inversion of the myth, the monomyth in many ways, right? And there are many ways in which you can argue, you know, you can take the monomyth structure and put it onto the hero's journey, and you can put it onto Christ's life, and you can kind of, you know, kind of distort it in there. But in many ways, it's very different, right? It's very different. Yeah. I mean, the hero is not normally put to death by people who a week earlier were lauding, waving palm fronds at him. That's a very strange story. What do you make of that? Like, I mean, that's probably something we could talk about for 4 hours or 4 years. But what do you?
Okay.
You're an expert. I mean, you know these 7 plots. You know the monomyth, right? Like, how do you think about the Christ myth? Not myth in the sense of something that's not true, but the crucifixion and resurrection myth as a story that we use to make sense of the world. How do you cross that boundary between the? Yeah. How do you think about it?
Well, I mean, in light of Tolkien's essay,
right?
He says that the ultimate Eucatastrophe story is the resurrection.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's this sense of down, 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 like the tragedy, down, 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 but then through all of that darkness and then popping out the other side somehow.
Yeah.
You know.
It's Andy in Shawshank, right? Like crawling through the shit, like going down, and then he emerges, right, in triumphant, right, in the rain.
Yes.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of,
So that's, I mean, the reason why it's very difficult, I think it's always been very difficult for people to take just sort of like things that are designed to help you write a novel or write a story and map it onto, or even reconcile it with, let's say, the gospel stories, is because my theory is that the gospel story is so packed and layered with meaning that you can't untangle it. You know, and Jonathan Peugeot talks about this, that there's all of these reconciling of opposites that are happening within that story. And so I would think of it more as, I was just listening to an old talk between Jonathan and Nicholas Kotar. Nicholas Kotar is a novelist who uses Russian fairy tales as his sort of guide for his novels.
Yeah, I need to look at him because Andrew with the Bangs
Yeah.
talked about him, right? As the hero.
Yes.
He's done some work on the heroine's jury. I've heard that name before, but I don't know his work. Does he write nonfiction as well, or is he making videos?
He's a
Like,
novelist. I think he's a novelist, but I haven't read any of his stuff. I'm hoping to meet him someday.
yeah, she seemed to imply that he'd done some analytical work, like either videos or nonfiction, or somewhere he's laying out some theories about the heroine's journey,
Yeah.
or is she just reading his novels and kind of?
No, he had a long conversation with her about the heroine's journey.
Oh, he did.
But
Okay.
one little tiny aspect of his knowledge. Apparently, he's very knowledgeable about this stuff,
Cool.
about story and everything.
Yeah.
But so one thing that he said was, you can think of, rather than thinking of history as like a timeline that moves forward, you can think of it as ripples that move outward from some central event, backwards and forwards in time. So his theory is, and I think Jonathan agrees with this, that like the let's say the Christ event is like the pebble that drops into the water and it ripples backwards through the Old Testament in the form of typology, and it ripples forwards into all the way up to today.
Well, there's sort of a rushback, right? I've never heard of that term. I'm just taking your term, but there's a rushback. Like there's a reinterpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, right?
Yes.
Via Christ, right? That is kind of fascinating, right? Really, really interesting.
Right.
Yep.
And so I think of it more like the reason why people have trouble making, let's say, a movie about Christ, or like it never captures it. It never,
No,
it's like it
exactly.
gets weird, like Last Temptation of Christ, or it gets, super violent like Mel Gibson or whatever. It just never quite captures it. I think of it more as that's like looking straight into the lamp, straight into the light source.
Right.
And
You're
you're
kind
like
of blinded
burning
a
your
bit.
eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to using that to shine on everything else in a way, or thinking of it like that's the thing that started all these ripples, and we're out somewhere here on the edge, away from it in some degree, and so what we're doing. So yeah, that's why I don't know. I have a real. That's one reason why I think it's so hard for people to dramatize, let's say, those stories, or to make a movie about that, or it's too densely packed with meaning, I think,
Yeah.
to try to entangle them.
Well, and also it had like stories are stylized in a certain way, right? And there's something about the crucifixion and resurrection that isn't quite. Girard's really helped me to see that there's like an anthropological element to that, right? Like that story is about how communities hold themselves together and how they engage in scapegoating, right? And that our modern movies and the monomyth they're really stories from the point of view of one person in a sense, right? And
Yeah.
Girard helped me to see that Christ's story is a reflection of like greater things going on, right? Like I you know what I love? I love, I've recently come back to Catholicism. I love this, like during the Passion, during Holy Week, right? That they, you do this whole acting out of the crucifixion. And
Yeah.
they like, in the Passion, right? The crowd, right? The congregation is the one that is shouting, "Crucify him." Like, I keep telling people, like in many ways, like, that alone, that one little detail alone is worth the price of admission for Christianity, right? Because it's taking you out of the like. I think there's like an urge to identify yourself with Christ, right? Like with the central character, and a lot of the story, a lot of how we've been taught those stories, and definitely the way I like, even as someone who would rejected the faith for many years, like I still had it in my head, like I am one of the crowd, right? I am one of the crowd. I'm not Christ in that story, right? I am like we are all participating in this. I don't know. I think there's something very powerful about that, and it's a weird
Well,
postmodern thing because it's pulling you
yeah.
out. It's pulling you out of one point of view and putting you in to like the point of view of the
Yes.
the evil, right? It's amazing,
And that's the Eucatastrophe,
right?
I think, because if you are identifying yourself with the crowd,
Right.
you're one who wants to scapegoat somebody else for your own shortcomings or your own decisions, and you want to
Or for
scapegoat
this,
somebody.
or for the sake of communal harmony, right? Or the
Yeah.
like my
Yes.
desire to be with the rest of the community.
Yeah.
We're gonna, yeah.
A common enemy. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And the Eucatastrophe is that behind the scenes, just like the
Right.
fates toying with Oedipus Rex,
Yep.
is this other big thing going on, which is actually designed not to cause you to blind yourself, but
Right.
to redeem you from
To
that. Yeah, yeah.
to
from that.
absolve me of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's why like, but it's interesting to think like, would Christ's story, does it fit naturally in the tragedy genre if you don't have the resurrection, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm it's just something that occurred to me while we were talking. I don't know that it does. I mean, it's certainly, without the resurrection, there's certainly a sense of like fate, right? Right? Like fate
Yeah.
coming for this great man, right? Like who's telling the truth, right? And I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You might be right. It might be just too. It's too.
Yeah.
It's too hard.
Well,
to see.
he rejects the Faustian deal.
Right.
when
Well,
he-
he does. Right. He does.
You know?
Exactly.
So
It's
it
more of
could-
a. I mean, I would argue it's more of an Oedipus Rex. Like without
Yeah.
the resurrection, it's more of
Without
an
the
Oedipus,
resurrection.
It's more of a pagan sort of Greek style story.
It would be. There's always a sense with those tragedies of, like, when the hero dies, you're like, look how corrupt this world is. This sense of kind of like
Right.
you're showing everybody how you're like, look what you did, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
With these tragedies, Thelma and Louise is like that. Thelma and Louise, it's like, look what you did. You made these two women drive into the Grand Canyon because they had no other option.
Well, and it's Chinatown. It's Chinatown too, right? Just it's Chinatown. This is just how it is, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a
Right.
deep resignation and cynicism about it.
But there's
Yeah.
also a sense that you're part of it.
Yes.
Like part of the corruption. In Thelma and Louise, it's like you're part of the corruption.
Yep. No matter how hard you try, right?
Yeah.
You're.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's something I've often. I've thought about. So you've seen. I've thought about going back to the Gospels and just reading them solely with my storytelling hat on. I've kind of resisted that because I don't know. But I guess other people have tried that. I assume. Have you read any interesting analyses like that or no?
Well, I think one of the difficulties of reading the Bible these days is that all of the theological debates that have happened over the years is how people interpret them now.
Yeah.
And rather than, like you said, like looking at the story. And so I have found commentators on the Old Testament that do that very well. Usually they're Jewish scholars like Robert Alter.
Okay.
They will actually look, because like if you think of, let's see, I'm part of the Reformed tradition.
Yeah.
And in the Reformed tradition, there's this notion of typology. And it's like, okay, so all of these patriarchs are types of Christ.
Okay.
And so when they go back and they look at the Old Testament, they're saying, see, this is how this person is a type of Christ, right? But sometimes I'm like, I already know that. I want to know more about what the story is doing. Like, what exactly is the story of Jacob doing? What is the story of Joseph doing, et cetera,
Yeah.
And so some of the times the Jewish scholars will actually help me with that better because they're not concerned with the typology question. And so therefore they can get into more of, like, let's say, the narrative elements within that story as it would have been read at that time,
Right.
you know, and that sort of thing. So
Well, and
I
you can,
find
and
that
you might be able to
oh,
see, like knowing the story of Christ, you might be able to see elements, right, like reflecting
yeah.
elements of that. But right, yeah,
Well, I'm not, I'm fine with typology. I'm just, sometimes I want to go a little, I want to know a little bit more than that. You know, I want to go deeper into it, you know,
yep.
and so those guys help me with that.
Did you
New
ever,
Testament, I haven't really found.
yeah, do you ever hear, do you ever listen to David Cayley's 6-part series on Rene Girard?
Oh,
So
no.
David
No.
Cayley is he's a writer, and he was a radio journalist for CBC. And so several years ago, there was this kind of intellectual show. I can't even remember what it was called, but it was like hour-long documentaries, right? And he did a 6-part series on Rene Girard, and it was prior to Girard passing. So he was talking to a lot of Girard's students, but he also had Girard on the show. And
Wow.
I need to go back to it. There's a kind of a tour de force thing that Girard does where he compares the story of Joseph from the Old Testament to the story of Oedipus Rex. And
Really?
he compares and contrasts the kind of the Jewish mindset versus the Oedipal, like the Greek mindset, and uses it to just highlight how different they are, and because Girard's theory is more than it's more than just focused on Christ, the crucifixion and resurrection, as an inversion of all the other myths, right? He's really focused on the whole Hebrew tradition of all of those stories as kind of undermining and being very subversive of the standard pagan worldview. And so anyway, if you, I'll try to find the link. I've been meaning to go back and listen to it again, because the first time I listened to it, I was like, whoa, it was such a, it was just kind of an impressive analysis, and I was trying to process it all at the same time, because you know, I've heard that story so many, I've heard the Joseph story so many times, I've heard the Oedipus story so many times, and to hear him crossing over and comparing and contrasting how many similarities, like that was one thing I never would have thought to compare Joseph and Oedipus Rex, right? But he immediately draws all these parallels. So yeah,
Because Joseph is the first time that there ever was a story about a scapegoat told from the point of view of the scapegoat.
yeah,
Joseph, that's Girard's theory,
yep,
right?
exactly, yep. Do I remember him saying that? I don't. I mean, he's definitely calling out, I don't know if he was explicitly doing this, but calling out the similarities between Joseph and the Christ story, right? There are just a lot of parallels there
Right.
that people have called out over the years. All right, well, it's a lot of interesting things. I'm trying to see if there was anything else I wanted to ask you about. What did you make of, Tolkien talks about, he kind of hints at it in the essay, the significance of prohibition in so many of these stories.
Oh, right, right.
And he doesn't really go into it very much, but he hints at it, and he's right though, right? There's prohibition.
Yeah.
It plays such, right. Don't feed the gremlin after midnight.
Yeah.
You know, like it's such a
Right.
common element of story, and I don't know why. I don't know why. I guess it has to do with like, it's passed down wisdom. Like, don't feed the gremlin after midnight is passed down wisdom, and all of us are always put in this position of some of the passed down wisdom is awesome, and some of it needs to be discarded. Right? We sometimes need to ignore the passed down wisdom, and maybe that's why it's so interesting. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if it's like you have to test to see which prohibitions are worth keeping or not.
Yeah.
And if you follow, sort of Peterson's idea of the character who dies in a story is dying in your place. You listen to the story and the character dies instead of you
Right.
dying. You
Right.
know, and so the character breaks the prohibition, which is like every Harry Potter story.
Yeah.
You know,
Right. Exactly.
but then there's a sense of figuring out maybe what's behind that simple. Maybe it's going from like a low resolution, just don't, like a kid, don't touch the stove, you
Yep.
know, to a high resolution version of, well, here's more what's going on behind that prohibition.
Well, and here's when you need to touch the stove, right? Because they're
Right.
like you can't like if we held to that rule for our whole life, we'd never right. We'd die
Yeah.
because we wouldn't have food.
Yes.
We have to
If you
touch the
just stuck
stove.
with the low, yeah, if you just did the low resolution version, you,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
There's
Yeah.
something fundamental about that, about changing from a child to an adult, right? Like the low resolution, follow the rules, versus the high resolution. Okay,
Yeah.
here are here's when I need to have an oven mitt on, right? Here's when I don't. I've made that mistake many times. Yeah, it's really interesting.
That's what all of the college students that I teach, that's what they're in the process of doing, updating their low resolution, whatever they were raised with,
Yep.
and becoming their own person and sort of deciding what they're going to keep and what they're going to discard or what they're going to update.
Well, and it's why stories can be so important because, right, if you can learn from what somebody did in the story, right, if the story has some bit of wisdom, because, violating certain rules, right, it could lead to death, right? Like if certain of those rules are in place for a very good reason. Yeah, I've always been it's fascinating because I resist rules like very, very strongly as a person. And so this process of coming back to the Catholic Church is fascinating because the Catholic Church has a lot of rules, right? And it's, I guess I've been trying to get to a higher resolution place where I see the wisdom behind some of the rules, which previously seemed so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's an important presupposition to have, that sort of this idea that probably there's a reason behind the rule, rather than just that, rules are stupid or something.
No, exactly.
Like a posture of, well, maybe, there's something I can, but you have to be willing to question the rule in order to do that as well.
You do. No, I agree. I think Louise Perry says something like traditions are experiments that worked, which is obviously a partial truth, right? That's not like we're definitely passed on some things that aren't quite right. I mean, there are many things. Yeah, I think, but there's a lot. The assumption that there's something in it, right? I think is a good one and can keep us out of trouble. Yeah. So where are you going? Where are you going with the 7 plots? Like, what's your grand? I'm curious just to hear what you're going to work your way through. How many have you done so far?
I've done. Let's see. I've done Rags to Riches, Overcoming the Monster, Voyage and Return, Tragedy, Quest. I could do a little bit more work on Quest, and then Rebirth will be next. So I got to do Rebirth and then comedy. That's probably what
So you're
I'm
going to go back to comedy because comedy comes at a previous spot.
In the life cycle, yeah. But I'm saving it because it's so hard.
Why do you think it's hard?
Well, Booker in particular, he talks about different epochs of comedy.
Yeah.
So when he talks about ancient Greek comedy, that's different than Shakespearean comedy.
Sure.
And so the Shakespearean comedy is more like what I said earlier, which is that there are you're trying to find your place in the world.
Yeah.
And so you all these disguise. So like, what was the one with Jack Lemmon and he dresses up as a woman and they're on a train.
Some Like It Hot.
Yeah, that's like the Shakespearean comedy.
Yeah.
Or like Midsummer Night's Dream, where everyone's in disguises.
Working Girl or Tootsie, right?
Yeah.
There are farces. Farce is like a version of that, like where farce has a lot of that, like disguises and everything seems chaotic, or order sort of like it's the Eucatastrophe. Order sort of comes in at the end, and everyone kind of ends up falling in. It's kind of a miraculous thing when it happens well, right? When you're carried through a comedy and everything seems chaotic, and then at the end, the craft of the storyteller, the director or the writer, and everything just kind of falls neatly into place. It's like Tetris in a way, right? It's very yeah.
And so that's one aspect of it, and then there's the aspect of just the happy ending. That's another sense of comedy. And
right.
then and then there's another sense of comedy which is funny, So I feel like I kind of got to pull all those apart in order to be able to say what I want to say. So I think it's just going to take a little bit of work on my part to
Yeah.
untangle. It's all been stacked up. Like the word comedy has so many different connotations to it. So I think that's why I'm saving it for
It's
last.
interesting just to wonder why there are so many different variations of that particular one, right? Like,
Mhm.
I've often thought, like, we're kind of in this era of the schlubby comedy, right? Maybe we're out of it now. I haven't been paying that much attention, but 40-Year-Old Virgin, all of the, like the Hangover, right? Like kind of screwed up guys. What's the one about where he gets the girl pregnant on a first date?
Oh, knocked up.
Knocked Up, right? Like
Yeah.
all of these kind of so different, right? Then if you look back, do you ever see The Awful Truth?
No, I don't think I saw
The
that.
Awful Truth is such a wonderful movie. It's Cary Grant and Irene Dunn, and
Hmm.
it's a comedy of remarriage. It's a screwball comedy. It's a classic screwball comedy, but these are wealthy people. Cary Grant is immensely appealing, right? He's just immensely appealing, and they're at the beginning of the movie they get divorced, and then they slowly kind of come back. But it's
Hmm.
so different, right? It's so different. It seems like comedy rides on the surface of culture in some sense, right? That it is more prone to like whatever the current winds in culture are. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's because it's at the top of the mountain, and like
Maybe.
culture
Yeah.
and so different cultures are climbing different mountains. I don't know.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Well, I do think it does have something to do with identity, like who we are,
Yeah,
who we are.
and you're
And
relatively at the top of the mountain already, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So anyway, I mean, to answer your question, so I want to go through those. I went finish the little YouTube series, but the YouTube series was all just to force myself to go through the material so that I can package it together to be a class. And so I'd like to teach it somewhere. Maybe they do have they're starting a new master's program at the school I teach at
Hmm.
in writing, screenwriting. Could be something like that, or it could be some kind of one of these online platform classes. And I'd like to pitch it as a book, someday too. So I'm just working it out, and then but I'm doing it out loud. I'm doing it kind of in front of everybody on YouTube, you
No,
know.
I think it's awesome. I just think go big, right? In the sense like, I mean, I love the idea of the class because that's
Yeah.
intimate and you're working with people who are trying to be filmmakers or whatever. But
Hmm.
I have, when I was screenwriting for a good decade or so, and I was taking lots of classes. I read a ton. I analyzed a ton of movies, right? I created a whole double-sided worksheet to analyze movies. I was very into the craft, and I just think you're doing some things, right, that I haven't seen done before, right, and that are very, very valuable. So I just think the book, and I love that the videos are out there because people are going to be able to find these, right? Like young screenwriters can find your work. I don't know. I just think it's really cool. So it's really good stuff.
The
So
emails I get are really funny,
yeah,
you know,
from
from people
from
like
screenwriters or from random people.
it's just I don't know who they are.
Yeah.
They're just the world. I mean, it's not very many people watch it, but the emails that I do get are just so glowing. It's just
Yeah. Well,
it's like, oh my God, this is mind blowing. I'm working on a story right now. You're helping me, so it's kind of fun.
Well, and I think it's good for so many people. So before I tried to be a screenwriter, I was a cognitive scientist. So I almost went to get a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. And so I took a lot of like psychology and linguistics and neuroscience. We dissected a brain, blah, blah, blah. And I have always said that I learned more about how the human brain works and how human beings work from the 10 years I spent as a screenwriter, right? Like just
Yeah.
trying to understand movies and trying to understand stories and how they work. I think it's very compelling, even for people who are not trying to, write, or not trying to make movies or tell stories, right? It's very deeply revealing about who we are, right? Anyway, it's good stuff. So, Well, I'm going to be really interested to pay attention. Maybe this is a good place to end. But thank you so much, Justin. Really appreciate your taking the time today.
Oh yeah, that's super fast. I mean, I am blown away by the level of conversations you can have.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so many. Just the quality of conversations online these days, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's so many smart people having conversations, and I feel out of my league in many ways. But just to be able to engage, right, other people, and to listen to Paul talk to really smart people and like analyze what Peterson is saying or what Peugeot is saying. It's
Yeah.
very, very intellectually stimulating in a way that college never was, you know, which is,
Yeah.
yeah, anyway. All right, well, hopefully we can do this again, and hopefully I can see you in person sometime soon.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.